Alright, you guys, we are ready for the second lesson in our French beaded zinnia. And today we're going to be making the petals using a technique called the continuous crossover loop. I hope you guys are very comfortable with the continuous loop because today we're going to be modifying that technique to make these crossovers. Basically, a crossover loop is a continuous loop that we're going to add more rows of beads to. So we're going to bring another row of bead up the front, cross over the top, and then another row of beads down the back. Alright, first let's take a look at Unit A for the zinnia. If you have a copy of the PDF of my pattern, you can look at that, and the pattern is going to say that we're going to be using either 26 or 24 gauge copper core wire for the petals. We're going to be using a size 11 seed beads in whatever petal color that you have chosen. And we need 1 unit A for each zinnia. And the actual component pattern for unit A is 11 CCL using 1.5 inches of beads for the starting loop. Now for the demo, I'm going to be using a different color of wire than beads because I want you guys to see my wires. But if you were able to find a matching copper core wire to your petals, I always recommend using it if you can find that matching wire. So this one I used red with red beads, but I need you guys to see what I'm doing with my wires in this, so I'm going to use a different color. Alright, so we're working with a continuous technique again, and that means that we need to start with that same starting tail wire. And again, unless the pattern specifically says otherwise, it is 2 to 3 inches. And then we're going to measure out the beads we need for our starting loop. And for this pattern, it is 1.5 inches. So I'm going to measure that out. And then I'm going to fold those beads in half, just like I would a continuous loop. Pinch and hold between my thumb and forefinger. And then I'm going to grab just the very bottoms of the loop. If I try to grab and twist up here, it's going to end up twisting the loop itself instead of just the wires below. So grab right down at the bottom, and we're going to twist 1 full rotation, which is usually about 2 twists. So 1, 2. Now if you twist down any further with a crossover loop, it's going to take your working wire down further past the bottom of your starting loop, which means that the beads that we're going to be adding for the next couple of rows are going to sink down below the bottom of that starting loop, which is something you don't want. So just 2 twists, 1 full rotation. Now we're going to mold the starting loop before we move forward. And we want to make it so that there's a little narrow opening in the center, because that's where we're going to be adding the next rows of beads. And we want to make sure that it's about the same distance all the way from the top to the bottom, the same width across. So now we're going to bring this working wire up over the front of our petal, and I'm going to give a nice tug here. My goal is to make sure that this wire is super flat against the front. I don't want to have I don't want a little bulge in my wire down here because that's going to make it so the beads can slide up and down. So I'm going to pull that really tight, and then I'm going to bring more beads down from my spool. And I'm going to push them down so they are even with or just above the bottom of that starting loop. Let me see if I can get in closer. A little bit. Okay, that's a little bit better. Alright, so the bottom of this next row is even with or directly above the bottom of the starting loop. And I'm going to measure to the top of my loop. And I'm going to measure so that the beads are even with or directly below the top of my starting loop. I don't want to go past that edge at all. Alright, now I'm going to take bare wire and I'm going to fold it down between 2 beads right at the top of my loop. And I'm going to use my thumb to kind of push down on the back of my petal on this wire to try and make it really tight. That's going to help me hold tension on this front row while I bring more beads up. I'm going to bring those beads up and I'm going to carefully slide them up. Make sure I don't lift up that wire in the middle. I'm going to push them right up against the back of the starting loop. And I'm going to fold them down to the bottom of my petal. And then we're going to measure the beads it takes to reach the bottom of that starting loop. Now you want to make sure that you do go all the way down here. If you're a little bit short, then again you're going to have a little bit of space in your wire where your beads are going to be able to move around. So measure all the way down to the bottom. And then I'm going to pinch and hold that row really tightly with my thumb there, because I got to wrap this row and I want to make sure it stays in place while I'm wrapping. And then I'm going to take my working wire and I'm going to pull it towards the front, and again give a nice little tug there so you don't end up with any wire slack or any bulges there at the bottom. And then I'm going to wrap around that bottom wire 2 times. And these wraps should be really close to the bottom of the petal, and they should also be really close to each other. It should look a little bit like a coil. And that's going to finish off our first petal. Now what we want to do here is actually to flatten these rows so that they are beside each other. Right now they're kind of bunched on top. So I'm going to flatten them so that I've got 4 rows across. Now if you have nylon jaw pliers, you can use those as well. If you're really careful with regular pliers, you can use those to flatten as well, but I worry that those are going to end up breaking or scratching my beads. Alright, now again we need to leave a space in our wire. It's a continuous technique. We need to leave a space because we need room to twist the wires below the starting loop and then also to wrap around the wire below the starting loop. But we also want a little bit of space left over. So we're going to leave about 1/4 inch. And I'm going to hold that space with my thumb and forefinger to make sure it doesn't shrink again. And I'm going to measure out the beads I need for my starting loop again, which is 1.5 inches. And I'm going to fold it in half. And then I'm going to twist. 1, 2. 1 full rotation. Mold that starting loop so I've got a narrow slit that is even all the way across from the bottom to the top. And I'm going to bring that working wire up over the front of my petal. Slide more beads down and push them down so that they are even with or just above the bottom of the starting loop. Measure to the top of the petal, and again we want it to be as close to the edge of the petal as we can without going past it. And then we're going to go down between 2 beads, as close to the center as you can. Sometimes it's not exact, maybe this would be better. Sometimes it's not exact, but you get as close as you can to the middle of your loop. Push down on that wire to help hold the tension. Bring more beads up and push them right up to the top of that starting loop again. Fold down the back. And we're going to measure the beads we need to reach, the bottom. Pinch and hold. And this time I'm going to move that that first loop out of the way. I'm going to move it at a 90-degree angle from my second petal. This is going to help make sure that the wire below my second petal is nice and straight when I wrap around it. I'm going to pull that working wire towards the front of my petal and give it a nice little tug. And then I'm going to wrap around twice to finish off the petal. And then again, I'm going to flatten those rows so they are beside each other rather than stacked on top of each other. Okay, let me demo that one more time. I'm going to leave a 1/4 inch space, measure out the beads for my starting loop, fold in half, twist 2, mold. Bring the wire up over the front and give it a nice little tug so it's nice and flat. Bring beads down and push them all the way to the bottom of the starting loop. Measure to the top. Fold over and fold beads down the back. Measure to the bottom. Make sure that wire is straight and wrap twice and flatten. All right, so there's 3 petals, and you're going to continue on until you have 11. And then you're going to close the unit like we did unit B of our stamen. Wrap the working wire once around the first petal, and then we're going to center the wire by coming across, looping around a petal on the opposite side, bringing them both to the bottom and twisting. And this time you can twist down a good inch or so below the flower, but we want to make sure that our twists are as smooth as we can make them. So if you've got a lot of extra lumpage here, then you're going to have extra lumps on your finished flower stem. All right, now Unit B is also continuous crossover loops. The pattern is 11 CCL using 2 inches of beads for the starting loop. So we've got the same number of petals, we're just making them a little bit longer. And you do need 2 of Unit B for each flower. Now if you're using 26 gauge, I want to show you guys something. So hold on here a bit. If you're using the 24 gauge, go ahead and close it the same way you did Unit A. Okay, now if you use 26 gauge wire for your petals, which you definitely can do, it's a little bit softer on your fingers than the 24 gauge that I usually use. But as you can see, the 26 gauge wire doesn't have a whole lot of support to it. It's a lot softer, and because of this, it doesn't have as much support as you get with the 24 gauge wire. So what you guys need to do is something called reinforcing. Now this is best done before you clip from the spool. So I've got mine still attached to my working wire here. Now we're going to close the unit into a circle the same way. We're going to wrap around that first loop right at the bottom. Now to reinforce the unit, I'm actually going to continue wrapping around the bottoms of each of the petals as I go around. So I wrapped around the first one. I'm going to come around and wrap around the second one. And then I'm going to wrap around the third one. And I'm going to continue going until I get back to my starting point. Okay, now basically what this has done is it's added an extra layer of wire around that center circle, and that's what's going to give you the extra support. Alright, and then we do have to center our wire, which we're going to do the same way. Bring across to the other side, loop around a petal over there, take it down to the bottom, and then twist together. Now when you're twisting, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but try to get these twists as smooth as you can. And you're going to do that by making sure that the wires are at the same angle away from the twisted stem. And then apply even pressure. It's almost easier to twist the flower sometimes. Alright, so try to get nice smooth twists, and then you can cut off your spool. Now again, that's only if you're using 26 gauge wire. You shouldn't need to do this with 24 gauge wire for a unit this size. Alright, there's one more thing that I want to show you before we move on to the next section here. Now normally a zinnia would look like this. You're going to have the unit A and the 2 unit B's. Now I'm not assembling it here, I just want to show you something here. Don't assemble your flowers yet. Alright. So the normal head of our zinnia is going to look something like this. We're going to do some shaping at the end to make it look a little bit more alive. But it's going to look like this. We've got a flower that has quite a few petals on it, but not all zinnia look like this. There is a simpler version of the zinnia flower, which you can accomplish just by removing the Unit A piece. So let me show you all that. If I take out the Unit A petals and just don't make any Unit A, then I've got a simpler zinnia with a simpler flower head. Now likewise, I could, if I wanted more petals, because some zinnias do have very tall flower heads, I could make extra Unit B. Now if you bought just enough for this project, then you won't have enough beads to do the extra Unit B, but just in the future if you ever wanted to make these again. Just a little note that I wanted to point out there, that you can customize the look of your flower just a little bit there.